Marcus Chen had always been told he was too stubborn for his own good. As his emergency pod crashed through the canopy of alien trees, those words echoed in his mind with bitter irony. The transport ship Meridian was nothing but scattered debris in orbit now, victim to a sudden solar flare that had fried every system simultaneously. While his crewmates had managed to reach the main escape vessels, Marcus had been stuck in the engineering section when the ship broke apart. The pod's impact threw him against the restraints with bone-jarring force. Emergency lights flickered weakly as the systems ran diagnostics. External sensors painted a grim picture: atmosphere breathable but with higher oxygen content than Earth normal, gravity about 20% heavier, and temperature readings that put the local climate somewhere between a tropical rainforest and a sauna. Marcus checked his survival kit with methodical precision. 3 days of water tablets, a week's worth of protein bars, basic medical supplies, a multi-tool, and the emergency beacon with a cracked display. The beacon's range was severely limited by the alien atmosphere's strange electromagnetic properties. He was truly alone. The pod's door hissed open, releasing him into a world that seemed designed by an artist with too much imagination and too little restraint. Towering trees stretched hundreds of meters into a canopy so thick it filtered the alien sun into an eerie green twilight. Vines as thick as his waist hung between the trunks, covered in flowers that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. The air hummed with the sounds of unseen creatures, a constant background symphony of clicks, whistles, and deep thrumming calls. Marcus had studied xenobiology during his engineering training, enough to know that Earth-like ecosystems on other worlds were statistically almost impossible. Yet here he stood in what looked like Earth's Amazon rainforest mixed with something from a fever dream. Either this planet had developed along remarkably similar lines to Earth, or something else was at play. He activated the pod's external sensors one final time before the battery died completely. The readings made his blood run cold. Something large was moving through the forest, something that registered as massive on the motion detectors. The thermal signature suggested a creature at least 4 meters long, with a body temperature that ran hot enough to show up clearly against the cooler forest background. And it was moving directly toward his position. Marcus grabbed his gear and stepped away from the pod. Whatever was coming, he didn't want to be trapped inside a metal box when it arrived. The forest floor was spongy underfoot, covered in a thick layer of decomposing plant matter that squelched with each step. Strange insects scattered away from his boots, their wings creating tiny rainbow prisms in the filtered light. A deep rumble echoed through the trees, low enough that Marcus felt it in his chest rather than heard it with his ears. The sound sent small creatures fleeing in panic, their frightened calls adding to the chaos. Marcus looked back at his pod and saw trees beginning to sway as something massive pushed through them. The first thing he noticed was the smell, a mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something chemical that burned his nostrils. Then came the sound of splintering wood as trees that had stood for decades were casually pushed aside. Marcus pressed himself against the trunk of a particularly large tree, trying to become invisible. When the creature finally emerged into view, Marcus had to fight the urge to run screaming. It stood nearly 6 meters tall at the shoulder, with a body that seemed like evolution had taken a bear, a lizard, and a nightmare, then decided to make them bigger and angrier. 6 powerful legs ended in claws that gouged deep furrows in the earth with each step. Its head was proportionally huge, dominated by a mouthful of teeth that looked more like crystalline formations than normal fangs, but it was the eyes that truly terrified Marcus. They were intelligent. This wasn't just some oversized predator operating on instinct. Those eyes held calculation, planning, and something that looked disturbingly like amusement as they fixed on the crash site. The creature circled the pod with deliberate care, examining it from every angle. It sniffed the air, then let out another one of those chest-deep rumbles. When it looked directly at Marcus's hiding spot, he was certain it had spotted him. Instead, the creature turned its attention back to the pod and began methodically tearing it apart. Marcus watched in fascination and growing horror as the alien predator demonstrated problem-solving skills that would have impressed a team of engineers. It didn't just destroy the pod randomly. Instead, it carefully dismantled the outer hull, examined the interior components, and even appeared to taste some of the metal pieces before discarding them. When the creature found the emergency food supplies, it consumed them with obvious enjoyment. When it discovered the water recycling system, It drank deeply, then destroyed the mechanism with what looked like deliberate spite. This wasn't hunger. This was intelligence at work. The message was clear. Whatever this creature was, it understood that the pod represented a potential threat or competition. It was systematically eliminating anything that might help the pod's occupants survive. The creature knew Marcus was here, and it was playing with him. As the alien predator finished its demolition work, it raised its head and let out a sound that was part roar, part laugh, and entirely chilling. Then it looked directly at Marcus's hiding place and made a deliberate show of sniffing the air. The message was unmistakable. I know exactly where you are, little human. I could end this whenever I choose. But that wouldn't be nearly as entertaining. The creature turned and melted back into the forest with surprising stealth for something so massive. Marcus waited a full hour before emerging from his hiding spot, every nerve screaming that this was exactly what the predator wanted him to do. As he surveyed the wreckage of his pod and the rapidly darkening alien sky, Marcus Chen realized he was facing something far worse than being stranded on a hostile world. He was being hunted by a creature that was not only physically superior in every way, but might actually be smarter than he was. The smart thing to do would be to find a defensible position and wait for rescue. The logical thing would be to avoid any confrontation with a predator that could tear him apart without effort. But Marcus had never been accused of being particularly smart or logical. As he shouldered his meager supplies and headed deeper into the alien wilderness, he was already beginning to plan. If this creature wanted to hunt a human, it was about to learn why that might not have been the wisest choice it ever made. The first lesson Marcus learned about surviving on an alien world was that his assumptions about natural laws could get him killed. The forest seemed peaceful enough during his first hour of travel, filled with the same background chorus of alien wildlife. Then the silence hit like a physical wall. Every sound stopped simultaneously. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus froze, his engineering mind immediately recognizing this as a warning system evolved by prey species over millions of years. When every creature in a forest suddenly went quiet, it meant something very dangerous was moving through their territory. The attack came from above. Marcus dove forward, just as 6 meters of alien predator crashed down from the canopy where it had been waiting. Claws that could have disemboweled him swept through the space where he'd been standing, gouging deep furrows in a tree trunk instead. The creature's landing shook the ground and Marcus felt the impact through his bones. Up close, the predator was even more terrifying. Its hide was covered in what looked like natural armor plating, dark green scales that shifted color to match the forest shadows. The crystalline teeth weren't just for show. They leaked some kind of fluid that hissed when it hit the ground, suggesting either venom or acid. Most disturbing of all were those intelligent eyes, watching his every move with what could only be described as scientific curiosity. Marcus rolled to his feet and ran. Behind him, he heard that rumbling laugh again, followed by the sound of massive claws finding purchase in tree bark. The creature was climbing, using the forest canopy like a highway while Marcus was stuck stumbling through the undergrowth below. The chase lasted 3 hours. Marcus quickly learned that his pursuer wasn't trying to catch him. It was studying him. Every time he found what seemed like a good hiding spot, the creature would appear just close enough to force him to run again. When he tried to backtrack, it was there waiting. When he attempted to climb a tree, it would shake the entire plant until he had to jump down or be thrown. The predator was mapping his capabilities, learning his limitations, and worst of all, it seemed to be enjoying itself immensely. Marcus's breakthrough came when he tried to cross a stream. The water was only knee-deep, but as he waded across, he noticed something crucial. The creature stopped at the water's edge and let out a sound of genuine frustration. It paced back and forth, clearly agitated, but made no attempt to follow him into the stream. Water. The predator was avoiding water. Marcus stood in the middle of the stream and studied his pursuer more carefully. Now that he wasn't running in panic, he could see details he'd missed before. The creature's feet were broad and padded, perfect for moving silently through soft forest floor but completely wrong for swimming. Its body was built for power and agility on land, not for aquatic movement. Most tellingly, those armor plates that looked so impressive were actually a liability in water. They would make the creature sink like a stone. The predator seemed to realize he'd figured something out. It let out a snarl that was pure frustration and began pacing more aggressively. Then it did something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It began methodically examining the stream, looking for the shallowest crossing points, testing the depth with its claws, studying the current. This wasn't just an intelligent predator. This was an intelligent predator that could learn and adapt its hunting strategies in real time. Marcus followed the stream deeper into the forest, staying in the water despite the way the alien minerals made his skin tingle. Behind him, his pursuer paralleled his course from the bank, never letting him out of sight. The creature was clearly working on a solution to the water problem, and Marcus had no doubt it would find one eventually. The stream led to a waterfall that dropped into a pool about 15 meters across. Marcus studied the scene carefully. The water was deep enough that even a creature the size of his pursuer wouldn't be able to touch bottom. The current from the waterfall would make swimming difficult even for something built for water. But the pool was also a dead end. Once he was in there, he'd be trapped if the creature found a way across. That's when Marcus noticed the vines. They hung down from the trees around the pool in thick clusters, some of them reaching almost to the water's surface. Marcus tested one carefully and found it would support his weight. An idea began forming in his mind, the kind of idea that his crewmates would have called either brilliant or suicidal. He looked back to see the predator watching from the tree line, those intelligent eyes clearly calculating something. The creature had found several places where it might be able to leap across the stream, and it was testing each one systematically. Marcus estimated he had maybe an hour before his pursuer worked out a solution. That was enough time. Marcus waded into the pool and began collecting materials. The alien plants yielded fibers that were stronger than earth rope when woven together. Strange fungi provided a sticky resin that worked like natural glue. Most importantly, he found stones in the stream bed that had been shaped by the current into perfect projectile weights. His plan was simple, primitive, and completely insane by any reasonable standard. He was going to turn the pool into a trap. Working frantically, Marcus wove a net from the plant fibers and anchored it just below the surface of the water using the weighted stones. He rigged a trigger system using more vines that would release a log he'd positioned above the pool. It was a deadfall trap on a massive scale, designed to work in 3 dimensions using the water as a crucial component. The predator appeared at the edge of the pool just as Marcus was finishing the camouflage work. It had solved the stream crossing problem by simply going around to where the waterfall provided a series of rocks that could serve as stepping stones. Now it crouched at the pool's edge, studying the scene with obvious suspicion. Marcus stood in the center of the pool, chest deep in water, holding his multi-tool like a weapon. To any observer, it would look like he'd been cornered and was making a desperate last stand. The predator seemed to come to the same conclusion, because it let out that rumbling laugh again and began picking its way carefully across the stepping stones. What happened next would have impressed any student of Earth's military history. The predator was halfway across when it triggered the first part of Marcus's trap. The vine net, invisible beneath the water's surface, tangled around the creature's legs. Designed for a terrestrial predator, the alien's balance was all wrong for fighting while partially submerged. It toppled into the pool with a splash that sent water cascading in all directions. Immediately, the creature's armor plating began dragging it down toward the bottom. It thrashed frantically trying to swim, but its body design made it hopeless. The net kept it from reaching the pool's edge, and the current from the waterfall prevented it from simply standing up in the shallower areas. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd actually won. Then he saw the creature's eyes and realized this was far from over. Even while drowning, the predator was learning. It stopped panicking and began methodically cutting through the net with its claws. Those crystalline teeth weren't just weapons, they were tools. Marcus triggered the second part of his trap. The log came crashing down, but the creature twisted at the last second and took the impact on its armored shoulder instead of its head. It hurt. The alien let out a roar of pain and rage, but it wasn't incapacitated. Now Marcus was face to face with a wounded, furious, and extremely intelligent predator in its element. The creature had adapted to fighting in water faster than should have been possible. It was using its claws to anchor itself to the pool bottom, while it methodically destroyed the rest of the net. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He dove underwater and began untying the anchor points of his own trap. If the creature wanted to turn his trap against him, he'd make sure there was no trap left to use. The underwater battle lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Marcus's lungs burned as he worked to free the weighted stones while the predator slashed at him with increasing desperation. He managed to release 3 of the 4 anchor points before his air ran out, and he had to surface. When he broke the surface, gasping, Marcus found himself looking directly into the creature's eyes from less than a meter away. The predator had managed to get its head above water and was breathing hard, but it was no longer trapped. Worse, it had learned something crucial from their encounter. It had learned that humans could be far more dangerous than they appeared. The creature swam to the pool's edge with surprising grace and hauled itself out. Water streamed from its armor as it shook itself like a massive dog. Then it looked back at Marcus still treading water in the center of the pool, and made a sound that was unmistakably applause. The predator had enjoyed their first real confrontation. It had learned valuable lessons about human ingenuity and determination. And most terrifying of all, Marcus could see in those intelligent eyes that it was already planning their next encounter. The creature turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Marcus alone in the pool with the uncomfortable realization that he'd just passed some kind of test. The real hunt was only beginning. Marcus spent the night in a tree, wedged between 2 massive branches 30 meters above the forest floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe from ground-based predators, and his encounter at the pool had taught him that his pursuer preferred to keep its feet on solid ground when possible. Sleep came in fragments between the sounds of the alien forest coming alive in the darkness. The nocturnal symphony was unlike anything Earth had ever produced. Creatures called to each other in harmonies that seemed almost musical, while others communicated through subsonic pulses that Marcus felt more than heard. Bioluminescent displays flickered through the canopy like natural fireworks, and something large moved through the trees with a grace that suggested it was perfectly at home in the 3-dimensional maze of branches and vines. When dawn arrived, in the form of pale green light filtering through the canopy, Marcus climbed down with a new understanding of his situation. This wasn't just about surviving until rescue came. The emergency beacon's range was too limited, and even if a search party found his pod's wreckage, they would assume he was dead. If he wanted to live, he would need to find a way off this planet himself. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his pursuer wasn't just hunting him for food or territory. The creature's behavior suggested something far more complex, a kind of intellectual curiosity that was both fascinating and terrifying. It was treating their encounters like experiments, gathering data about human capabilities and responses. Marcus made his first major discovery while following the stream toward what he hoped might be higher ground. Hidden among the root systems of the massive trees, he found structures that definitely weren't natural. They were small, no bigger than his fist, but clearly artificial. Geometric shapes carved from the same crystalline material as his pursuer's teeth. As he examined them more closely, Marcus realized they were markers of some kind. Each one was slightly different, covered in symbols that looked like a writing system. They were arranged in a pattern that suggested a map or navigation system. Someone, or something, had marked a trail through this forest. The implications were staggering. His pursuer wasn't the only intelligent creature on this planet. There was an entire civilization here, one advanced enough to create permanent markers and possibly much more. The crystalline teeth weren't just natural evolution. They were tools created by a species that had mastered materials science. Marcus followed the trail markers deeper into the forest, his engineering background helping him recognize the sophisticated logic behind their placement. They weren't just random waypoints. They were positioned to take advantage of natural features, to mark the safest routes through areas that might be dangerous, and to provide sightlines for long-distance navigation. The trail led to a clearing where Marcus found his second major discovery: ruins. They weren't impressive by human standards, just a collection of low stone structures covered in centuries of vegetation growth. But they represented proof that his pursuer's species had once built permanent settlements. More importantly, the ruins showed signs of deliberate abandonment rather than destruction. Whatever had happened here, it had been planned. Marcus explored the ruins carefully, his multi-tool helping him clear away enough vegetation to examine the structures properly. The architecture was fascinating, built low to the ground but with incredibly thick walls designed to withstand massive impacts. Everything was constructed on a scale that matched his pursuer's size, but the craftsmanship was delicate, almost artistic. In the largest structure, Marcus found what looked like a ceremonial chamber. The walls were covered in carvings that told a story in pictures. His pursuer's species had once been builders, creators, artists. They had built cities, developed agriculture, and created what looked like a complex social structure. Then something had changed. The later carvings showed a dramatic shift in the species' development. The cities were abandoned, the agriculture forgotten, and the complex social structures replaced by something far more primitive. But it wasn't a collapse, it was a choice. The carvings showed the species deliberately returning to a hunter lifestyle, abandoning their civilization in favor of something that looked disturbingly like what Marcus was experiencing now. They had turned survival into an art form. The final carving showed a scene that made Marcus's blood run cold. Creatures that were obviously his pursuer's species were shown engaging in elaborate hunts, not for food, but for sport and intellectual stimulation. The prey wasn't always the same species. The carvings showed a variety of different creatures being hunted, each one clearly intelligent based on the tools and structures depicted around them. Marcus was looking at the historical record of a species that had evolved beyond the need to hunt for survival and had instead turned hunting into a form of entertainment and education. They sought out the most challenging prey they could find, not to eat them but to test themselves against different forms of intelligence and adaptation. He wasn't being hunted by a primitive predator. He was being hunted by a post-civilization intelligence that had chosen to return to hunting as a form of intellectual exercise. The sound of deliberate footsteps outside the ruins announced his pursuer's arrival. Marcus had been so absorbed in his discovery that he'd forgotten to watch for signs of being followed. Now he was trapped in a dead-end chamber with only one exit, and that exit was blocked by 6 meters of intelligent alien predator. But this time, the creature didn't attack. Instead, it settled down in the doorway like a patient teacher and made a series of soft sounds that were clearly communicative rather than threatening. When Marcus didn't respond, the creature used one claw to point at the carvings on the wall, then at Marcus, then at itself. The message was unmistakable. "You understand now, don't you?" Marcus studied his pursuer with new eyes. The creature wasn't just intelligent, it was educated. It knew the history of its own species, understood the significance of the ruins, and had deliberately led Marcus here to make sure he learned the truth about their situation. This wasn't a simple predator-prey relationship. This was a test, an examination, a form of intellectual discourse conducted through the medium of survival challenges. His pursuer was trying to determine what kind of intelligence humans represented, how they adapted to extreme situations, and what unique capabilities they might possess. The creature made another series of sounds, these ones clearly questioning. It was asking Marcus what he intended to do with this new knowledge. Marcus stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. He walked to the wall and placed his hand on one of the carvings showing the abandoned cities. Then he looked directly at his pursuer and spoke clearly. "You gave up everything your species built because you found something more interesting in the hunt itself. You turned survival into an art form, intellectual challenge into entertainment. But you're not just hunting me for sport. You're trying to understand what humans are capable of when pushed to our limits." The creature's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised that Marcus could speak coherently about their situation, rather than just running and hiding. Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence. "The problem is you've been thinking about this all wrong. You're treating this like I'm just another test subject to be studied and eventually disposed of. But humans don't work that way. We don't just adapt to survive, we adapt to win, and we especially don't like being treated like lab rats." The creature tilted its massive head, clearly intrigued by this development. It made a sound that was unmistakably amused. Marcus smiled grimly. "You want to see what humans are really capable of? You want to understand what makes us different from all the other species you've hunted? Then stop treating this like an experiment, and start treating it like a real competition. Because I'm not just going to survive your tests, I'm going to beat them. And then I'm going to teach you why even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy have learned to respect human stubbornness." The creature stood up slowly, its eyes now showing something that looked remarkably like respect. It moved aside from the doorway, clearly offering Marcus the chance to leave the ruins freely. but it also made a sound that was unmistakably a challenge accepted. As Marcus walked past his pursuer and back into the forest, he realized that everything had changed. This was no longer about survival. It was about proving that human ingenuity and determination could match anything the galaxy could throw at them. His pursuer had wanted to study human capabilities under extreme conditions. It was about to get a comprehensive education. Marcus spent the next 2 days completely reframing his approach to the situation. If his pursuer wanted to study human capabilities under pressure, then Marcus would give it a comprehensive demonstration of exactly why humans had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most stubborn problem solvers. The first lesson he decided to teach involved the human concept of persistence hunting. Marcus had learned from the ruins that his pursuer's species was built for short bursts of incredible power and speed, but their heavy armor and massive size meant they couldn't maintain high energy output for extended periods. Humans, on the other hand, were evolution's answer to the marathon rather than the sprint, where his pursuer could tear trees apart with its claws. Marcus could keep moving long after the alien equivalent of adrenaline had worn off. He began by establishing a pattern that would seem random to most predators, but was actually carefully calculated. Marcus would emerge from hiding at regular intervals just long enough to be spotted, then disappear again into terrain that forced his pursuer to expend maximum energy to follow. Dense undergrowth that required the creature to smash through obstacles, rocky areas where its claws couldn't find easy purchase, stream crossings that forced it to go around while Marcus waded straight through. At first, the creature seemed to enjoy this new game. It pursued Marcus with what appeared to be enthusiasm, treating each chase like a puzzle to be solved. But as the hours wore on, Marcus began to notice signs of fatigue. The creature's movements became less fluid, its breathing more labored, and most tellingly, it began taking longer rest periods between pursuits. By the end of the second day, Marcus had managed something remarkable. He had exhausted a predator that outweighed him by several orders of magnitude and was built like a living tank. When the creature finally settled down for what was clearly going to be an extended rest period, Marcus was still moving, still alert, and still planning his next move. The lesson wasn't lost on his pursuer. When it next encountered him, the creature's approach was noticeably more cautious, more conservative of energy. It had learned that humans possessed a form of endurance that could outlast even the most physically powerful opponents. But Marcus wasn't finished with his education program. His second demonstration involved the human talent for tool creation and environmental manipulation. Using materials gathered from the forest, Marcus began constructing what amounted to an obstacle course designed specifically to showcase human problem-solving abilities. The course started with a simple rope bridge across a ravine, made from woven plant fibers and suspended between two trees. Any creature with sufficient jumping ability could simply leap across, but the bridge was designed to support only human-sized weight. When his pursuer attempted to cross, the carefully calculated stress points failed exactly as Marcus had planned, dumping the creature into the ravine below. The fall wasn't dangerous, Marcus had made sure of that, but it was humiliating. And more importantly, it demonstrated that humans could manipulate their environment in ways that turned physical disadvantages into strategic advantages. The second obstacle was a maze constructed from fallen logs and deliberately placed debris. Again, most large predators would simply smash through such barriers, but Marcus had built the maze to turn brute force against itself. Each attempt to break through triggered carefully placed deadfalls and diversions that redirected the attacker away from the correct path while expending maximum energy. The creature spent nearly an hour working through the maze, and Marcus could see its frustration growing with each dead end and false solution. When it finally emerged, there was something new in its eyes, a kind of grudging respect for the complexity of human tactical thinking. But the third obstacle was where Marcus truly demonstrated why humans had become known throughout the galaxy as the species that simply refused to accept defeat. He built a trap that was impossible to solve using traditional predator thinking. It appeared to be a simple pit covered with vegetation, the kind of trap that most intelligent creatures would easily detect and avoid. But Marcus had actually constructed something far more sophisticated, a multi-layered psychological puzzle that required understanding human logic to navigate safely. The obvious path around the pit led to a second, better concealed trap. The route that looked moderately dangerous led to a dead end. The path that appeared suicidally risky was actually the only safe passage, but it required taking a leap of faith that most survival-oriented creatures would never consider. Marcus watched from concealment as his pursuer studied the situation. The creature was clearly intelligent enough to recognize the trap, smart enough to look for alternatives, and experienced enough to suspect that the obvious solutions were probably wrong. But what it couldn't understand was the uniquely human willingness to choose the most dangerous-looking option precisely because it was the most dangerous-looking option. After nearly 2 hours of careful analysis, the creature finally chose what it considered the safest route. It triggered the second trap exactly as Marcus had predicted, ending up tangled in a net while Marcus emerged from hiding and walked calmly along the suicidal path that was actually perfectly safe. The psychological impact was profound. Marcus could see in the creature's eyes that it was beginning to understand something fundamental about human thinking that it had never encountered before. Humans didn't just solve problems. They anticipated the assumptions their opponents would make about human problem-solving and turned those assumptions into weapons. But the real revelation came when Marcus deliberately triggered his own trap. Instead of walking away and leaving the creature tangled, Marcus approached the net and began carefully untangling his pursuer. The act was so unexpected that the creature froze completely, clearly unable to process what was happening. Marcus worked steadily, his movements calm and methodical. When the creature was free, he stepped back and spoke clearly. "This is what you really wanted to understand, isn't it? You've been studying how humans respond to pressure, how we solve problems, how we adapt to survival situations. But you missed the most important thing about us. We don't just survive, we transform the situation itself. We turn competitions into collaborations, enemies into students, and impossible situations into opportunities to demonstrate that the universe is a much more interesting place when humans are involved." The creature stared at him for a long moment, then made a sound that was unmistakably thoughtful. For the first time since their encounters began, it seemed genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "You gave up civilization because you found hunting more intellectually stimulating. But what if there was something even more challenging than hunting? What if there was a way to engage with intelligence that didn't require dominance and submission? What if the most interesting test wasn't whether you could defeat human ingenuity, but whether you could understand it well enough to work with it?" The creature settled back on its haunches, clearly processing this entirely new concept. Marcus could see the wheels turning in those intelligent eyes as it contemplated possibilities that had never occurred to its species before. "I'm not just another test subject," Marcus said firmly. "I'm an opportunity. You want to study human capabilities? Then stop trying to break me and start trying to understand what humans do when we're working with someone, instead of against them, because that's when we really become dangerous." The silence that followed stretched for several minutes. When the creature finally stood up, its posture was different, less predatory, more curious. It made a series of sounds that were clearly communicative, then gestured toward the forest with what could only be described as an invitation. Marcus realized that their relationship had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer being hunted. He was being recruited. The creature wanted to see what humans could accomplish when they weren't fighting for survival, but working toward a goal. And Marcus was beginning to suspect that goal might be far more interesting than simply escaping this planet. As they moved deeper into the forest together, Marcus couldn't help but smile. His pursuer had wanted to study human capabilities under extreme conditions. Instead, it was about to discover what humans could accomplish when they decided to stop being victims and start being partners. The real adventure was just beginning. The creature led Marcus through parts of the forest he would never have found on his own, moving with purpose along trails that were invisible to human eyes, but clearly well known to his new companion. As they traveled, Marcus began to notice details that painted a troubling picture of this alien world. The forest was dying. It wasn't obvious at first glance. The trees were still massive, the undergrowth still lush, and the wildlife still abundant. But Marcus's engineering background had trained him to look for systemic problems, and the signs were there once he knew what to look for. Patches of diseased vegetation scattered throughout the canopy, streams that ran slightly the wrong color, wildlife behavior that suggested stress patterns in the ecosystem. His companion, Marcus had decided to call it Hunter for simplicity, seemed to be monitoring these problems systematically. It would stop at certain locations, examine specific plants or water sources, and make notes in a crystalline device that it carried. The creature was conducting some kind of scientific survey, documenting the progression of whatever was killing this world. Their destination turned out to be another set of ruins. But these were far more extensive than the ceremonial site Marcus had discovered earlier. This had been a major city, with buildings that rose in organic curves toward the canopy and sophisticated water management systems that still functioned after centuries of abandonment. Most impressively, it contained technology that was clearly advanced by any species standards. Hunter led Marcus to a structure at the city center that could only be described as a laboratory. The interior was filled with equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. Displays that showed real-time data about the planet's condition, and most remarkably, what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the local stellar region. Marcus studied the displays with growing understanding and horror. The planet wasn't just sick, it was being systematically poisoned by radiation from a nearby star that was in the process of dying. The stellar map showed the star's expanding envelope of deadly radiation spreading through the system. Sterilizing world after world, Hunter activated a device that projected holographic images while making a series of sounds that were clearly explanatory. The story the images told was devastating. Hunter's species had detected the stellar threat decades ago and had attempted to develop solutions. They had tried everything their advanced technology could accomplish: atmospheric processors, radiation shields, even plans to relocate their entire ecosystem to another world. Nothing had worked. The dying star was simply too massive, too energetic, and too close. Their technology was insufficient to save their world, so they had made a choice that Marcus was beginning to understand was characteristic of their species. If they couldn't save their civilization, they would at least ensure that their knowledge and culture survived in some form. They had abandoned their cities, returned to a simpler lifestyle that required fewer resources, and began what amounted to a systematic documentation project. They had become living libraries, preserving everything they could about their species and their world, before the radiation made their planet uninhabitable. The hunts weren't just intellectual exercises, they were recruitment tests, designed to identify other intelligent species that might be capable of understanding and preserving their legacy. Marcus stared at the star charts, his mind racing through calculations. The radiation levels would make the planet uninhabitable within another few years at most. Hunter's species was facing extinction, and they knew it, but Marcus was seeing something that Hunter's species had apparently missed. "You've been thinking about this problem the wrong way," Marcus said aloud, pointing at the stellar projection. "You've been trying to protect your planet from the radiation. But what if instead of stopping the radiation you redirected it?" Hunter made an interrogative sound, clearly not understanding. Marcus moved to one of the control interfaces and began manipulating the display, grateful that the alien technology was intuitive enough for him to operate. "Your species thinks like engineers. When you see a problem, you try to build a solution that directly counters the threat. But humans think like humans. We look for ways to turn the threat itself into part of the solution." The holographic display shifted as Marcus input his ideas. Instead of showing radiation as a destructive force to be blocked, he was modeling it as an energy source to be harvested and redirected. "The dying star is putting out enormous amounts of energy," Marcus explained, his excitement growing as the possibilities became clear. "Instead of trying to block that energy, you build a network of collectors that capture it and use it to power massive terraforming systems. You don't fight the radiation, you eat it." Hunter's eyes widened as it began to understand the implications. The creature moved to another control interface and began inputting data with rapid, precise movements. The display showed Hunter running calculations, testing Marcus's hypothesis against the real-world parameters of their situation. The results were promising. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. More importantly, the solution would require exactly the kind of collaboration that Marcus had been trying to demonstrate. Hunter's species had the advanced technology and detailed knowledge of the local stellar environment. Humans brought the kind of lateral thinking that could find solutions where others saw only problems. But implementing such a plan would require more than just the two of them. It would need the cooperation of Hunter's entire species, and Marcus wasn't sure they would be willing to trust a solution proposed by an alien who had literally dropped out of the sky. Hunter seemed to understand his concern. The creature activated another device, and suddenly the laboratory was filled with more of its species. Not physically, these were holographic projections, but they were clearly live communications, with other members of Hunter's people scattered across the planet. What followed was the most remarkable interspecies conference Marcus had ever witnessed. Hunter presented Marcus's solution to what appeared to be the scientific leadership of an entire civilization, translating concepts between human and alien thinking in real time. Marcus found himself explaining human engineering principles to creatures who had abandoned engineering centuries ago, while trying to understand alien physics that was far more advanced than anything Earth had developed. The debate was intense. Marcus could see that some of Hunter's people were skeptical about trusting their species' survival to an alien solution. Others were excited by the possibility of actually saving their world, rather than just documenting its death. A few seemed primarily interested in the intellectual challenge that such a project would represent. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge. The plan was possible, difficult, requiring resources and coordination on a planetary scale, but possible. More importantly, it represented something that Hunter's species had lost when they abandoned their cities: hope. The meeting ended with what was clearly a formal agreement. Marcus would work with Hunter's people to develop the detailed engineering specifications for the radiation collection and redirection system. In return, they would provide him with the advanced technology and scientific knowledge needed to make the plan work. But there was another element to the agreement that surprised Marcus. Once the Planetary Salvation Project was complete, Hunter's species wanted to continue their collaboration with humans. They had discovered that the combination of their advanced technology and human lateral thinking could solve problems that neither species could handle alone. They were offering Marcus not just a way to save their world, but a way to forge an alliance between their species and humanity that could benefit both civilizations. For centuries to come, as the holograms faded and Hunter began activating systems throughout the laboratory, Marcus realized that his crash landing on this world might turn out to be one of the most fortunate accidents in human history. He had come here as a victim of circumstance, been hunted as a test subject, and was now being embraced as a partner in the salvation of an entire world. The project ahead of them would be monumentally difficult. They would need to build a network of energy collectors across multiple continents, coordinate the efforts of an entire civilization, and implement technologies that existed only in theoretical form. It would require every bit of human stubbornness and alien advanced science they could muster. But as Marcus looked at Hunter, who was already deep in planning mode, he couldn't help but smile. If there was one thing humans were good at, it was taking impossible situations and making them work anyway. The real test of human capabilities was about to begin. The next 3 weeks tested every assumption Marcus had ever made about what was possible, when two radically different species decided to work together toward a common goal. What emerged was a collaboration that combined the best of both civilizations while compensating for their respective weaknesses. Hunter's people brought technological capabilities that seemed almost magical to Marcus. They could manipulate matter at the molecular level, had mastered energy storage and transmission that made human fusion power look primitive, and possessed computational abilities that could model complex systems across planetary scales. Their main limitation was that their thinking had become highly structured over millennia of advanced civilization. They approached problems methodically, logically, and thoroughly, but they had difficulty making the intuitive leaps that led to breakthrough solutions. Marcus brought something they had never encountered before: the human ability to look at a complex system and immediately see the one weird solution that nobody else would think to try. Where Hunter's people saw radiation collectors as sophisticated technological constructs that required precise engineering and careful placement, Marcus saw an opportunity to turn the planet's existing ecosystem into a living component of the collection network. The breakthrough came when Marcus suggested that instead of building artificial collectors, they could genetically modify the planet's plant life to absorb and concentrate the deadly radiation then harvest that concentrated energy using Hunter's advanced extraction technology. It was a solution that was part biotechnology, part terraforming, and part agricultural science. The kind of hybrid approach that no single species would have developed on its own. The implementation required them to work at a pace that would have been impossible for either species alone. Hunter's people had to abandon their methodical planning approach and embrace rapid prototyping and field testing. Marcus had to learn to think on the scale of planetary engineering while working with technologies that were centuries beyond human development. The first test site was a forest, clearing about 10 kilometers from the abandoned city. Marcus and Hunter worked together to modify a small grove of trees, using Hunter's genetic manipulation technology, guided by Marcus's understanding of biological systems and energy flow. The modified trees began absorbing radiation at rates that far exceeded their original projections, their leaves literally glowing with captured energy that the extraction systems could then convert into usable power. But success brought new challenges. The energy output was so much higher than expected that the extraction systems were being overloaded. Hunter's people had designed their technology to handle the energy levels they had calculated, not the exponentially higher levels that Marcus's biological approach was producing. This led to the first major crisis of their collaboration. Some of Hunter's people wanted to scale back the biological modifications to match their existing technology. Others wanted to completely redesign their extraction systems, which would add months to the project timeline. The planet didn't have months. The radiation levels were increasing exponentially as the dying star entered its final phase. Marcus proposed a solution that horrified Hunter's people and would have terrified any sane human engineer. Instead of scaling back the biological systems or rebuilding the extraction technology, he suggested they use the overload itself as a feature rather than a bug. His plan was to deliberately trigger controlled overloads in the extraction systems, using the explosive energy releases to power massive atmospheric processors that would simultaneously clean the existing radiation from the planet's atmosphere, while the biological collectors continued to absorb the incoming radiation. It was using a catastrophic failure as an essential component of the solution. The debate that followed revealed fundamental differences in how the two species approached risk. Hunter's people had spent millennia developing technologies that were safe, reliable, and predictable. The idea of deliberately causing system failures as part of normal operation was almost incomprehensible to them. But Marcus had grown up in a species that had reached the stars by strapping themselves to controlled explosions and had solved most of their major engineering challenges by finding ways to make dangerous things useful. To humans, controlled catastrophic failure wasn't a bug in the system, it was. Tuesday, Hunter finally convinced its people to try Marcus's approach by pointing out that their conventional methods had already failed to solve the problem. If they were going to die anyway, they might as well die trying something that their most pessimistic calculations said had a 15% chance of working. The first controlled overload was spectacular. The energy release was visible from orbit, sent shockwaves through the forest that knocked down trees for kilometers in every direction, and created a temporary aurora that painted the sky in colors that had no names in any language. It also successfully cleaned approximately 10,000 square kilometers of atmosphere while simultaneously powering terraforming systems that began rebuilding the damaged ecosystem at an accelerated rate. More importantly, it worked exactly as Marcus had predicted. Within days, Hunter's people were embracing controlled catastrophic failure with an enthusiasm that worried Marcus almost as much as their previous conservatism had. They began incorporating deliberate overloads into systems throughout their civilization, turning what had been their most advanced and stable technology into something that resembled a controlled series of explosions. The transformation was remarkable. Hunter's people rediscovered a joy in engineering that they had lost centuries ago when their technology had become so advanced that it no longer required creativity to operate. Working with Marcus had reminded them that the most interesting solutions were often the ones that shouldn't work but did anyway. As the network of biological collectors and explosive extraction systems spread across the planet, Marcus found himself working with teams of Hunter's people who were displaying innovations that surprised even him. They were taking his human approach to controlled chaos and applying it to technologies that were far beyond human understanding. creating hybrid systems that neither species could have imagined independently. The project reached its climax when they activated the planetary network simultaneously. Thousands of biological collector sites across the planet began absorbing radiation while extraction systems triggered precisely timed controlled overloads that powered atmospheric processors on a continental scale. For 72 hours, the planet was essentially one massive controlled explosion. Energy releases that individually exceeded the power output of small suns created a symphony of destruction and reconstruction that reshaped the world's atmosphere, cleaned centuries of accumulated radiation, and established sustainable systems for handling the continuing stellar crisis. When the energy releases finally stabilized, Marcus and Hunter stood together in the central laboratory, watching displays that showed a planet that was not only surviving the stellar crisis, but was actually being improved by it. The dying star's radiation was now being converted into the energy that powered advanced terraforming systems, turning a threat to planetary survival into the foundation for unprecedented ecological restoration. But the real measure of their success wasn't the technical achievement, it was the change in Hunter's people themselves. They had rediscovered their capacity for innovation, their willingness to take calculated risks, and their joy in solving impossible problems. The collaboration with Marcus had transformed them from a dying civilization that was documenting its own extinction into a vibrant society that was actively reshaping its world. Hunter turned to Marcus and made a series of sounds that the translation system rendered as gratitude, admiration, and something that didn't translate well but seemed to mean the joy of discovering that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. Marcus understood the feeling completely. He had started this experience as a stranded human, trying to survive on an alien world. He was ending it as a partner in one of the most ambitious engineering projects in galactic history, working with a species that had taught him that human ingenuity was even more powerful when it was combined with alien wisdom. But even as they celebrated their success, Marcus could see new challenges appearing on the displays. Other worlds in the system were facing similar stellar threats, and preliminary surveys suggested that there were entire regions of space where dying stars were creating refugee crises on a galactic scale. Hunter's people had already begun reaching out to other species, offering to share the biological collector technology in exchange for other innovations and perspectives. They had learned that diversity of thinking was the key to solving problems that seemed impossible, and they were eager to continue expanding their network of collaborative partnerships. Marcus realized that his crash landing on this world had accidentally started something much larger than saving a single planet. They had proven that the combination of different species' capabilities could solve problems that no single civilization could handle alone. They had created a model for galactic cooperation that could change the balance of power throughout the galaxy, not through conquest or dominance, but through the simple. 6 months after the Planetary Salvation Project's completion, Marcus stood in the observation deck of a ship that hadn't existed when he first crashed on Hunter's world. The vessel was a perfect example of what happened when human engineering principles met advanced alien technology. It was simultaneously the most sophisticated spacecraft he had ever seen, and the most jury-rigged collection of controlled explosions ever put into service. Hunter's people had embraced human engineering philosophy so thoroughly that their new ships were essentially flying demonstrations of controlled catastrophic failure. They used controlled antimatter detonations for propulsion, deliberately triggered cascade failures for power generation, and navigation systems that relied on quantum uncertainty to plot courses through space-time. To human eyes, the ships looked like they were perpetually on the verge of spectacular disaster. To Hunter's people, they represented the most elegant and effective technology their species had ever created. The destination displayed on the navigation screen would have been impossible to reach with either species' technology alone. They were heading to a system where 3 different civilizations were facing extinction from a variety of stellar and planetary crises, and they were carrying solutions that combined human lateral thinking with the advanced capabilities of Hunter's people. What had started as Marcus's individual survival story had evolved into something much larger. The collaboration between humans and Hunter's species had proven so effective that word had spread throughout the local galactic community. Other species were requesting assistance with problems that their own technologies couldn't solve. And in every case, the combination of human ingenuity and alien advanced capabilities was producing results that surprised everyone involved. The ship's crew reflected this new reality. In addition to Marcus and Hunter, they carried representatives from 4 other species, each bringing their own unique perspectives and capabilities to the problem-solving team. The conversations in the ship's common areas had become fascinating examples of how different forms of intelligence could complement each other when working toward common goals. But the most significant change was in Hunter itself. The creature that had once hunted Marcus for intellectual stimulation had become something entirely new. A bridge between species, a translator not just of languages, but of entire ways of thinking. Hunter had discovered that the joy of the hunt paled in comparison to the satisfaction of collaborative discovery. Marcus often found Hunter in the ship's laboratory, working with equipment that combined the technological capabilities of 6 different species into systems that no single civilization could have conceived. The creature that had once treated intelligence as prey to be studied had become a teacher, helping other species understand the benefits of diversity. In thinking and approach, their first destination was a world where an aquatic species was facing extinction from volcanic activity that was poisoning their oceans. The planet's scientists had calculated that their technological capabilities were insufficient to neutralize the volcanic threat, and they had begun preparing for the evacuation of their entire civilization. The solution Marcus proposed would have been considered insane by conventional engineering standards. Instead of trying to stop the volcanic activity, he suggested they use Hunter's people's matter manipulation technology to modify the volcanic output itself, turning the poison into nutrients and the thermal energy into power for massive ocean purification systems. The project required the aquatic species' understanding of ocean ecology, Hunter's people's advanced material science, and human willingness to treat a planetary catastrophe as a resource to be exploited rather than a problem to be solved. The result was not only the salvation of the aquatic world, but the creation of ocean systems that were healthier and more productive than they had been before the volcanic crisis. More importantly, the aquatic species contributed their own unique capabilities to the growing alliance. Their understanding of 3-dimensional thinking in fluid environments led to breakthrough developments in space navigation and energy flow management that benefited all the member species. Each subsequent world they visited added new capabilities and perspectives to their growing coalition. A silicon-based species contributed crystalline computing technologies that revolutionized information processing. A hive mind civilization shared collective problem-solving techniques that enhanced individual creativity. An energy-based species provided insights into power management that made previously impossible projects feasible. But the most remarkable development was how each species was transformed by exposure to human thinking patterns. The aquatic species began experimenting with controlled flooding techniques that used water damage as a construction tool. The silicon-based species started incorporating deliberate structural failures into their crystal matrices to create more adaptive computing systems. Even the energy beings began using controlled dispersal patterns that technically constituted temporary death as a normal part of their life cycles. Marcus realized that humans weren't just contributing solutions to specific problems, they were teaching other species to think in ways that unlocked capabilities those species didn't know they possessed. The human approach to controlled chaos, acceptable risk, and turning disasters into opportunities was spreading throughout the local galactic community like a beneficial virus. The transformation was so profound that several species had begun referring to human-influenced thinking as chaos engineering, the deliberate introduction of controlled unpredictability into stable systems to unlock emergent capabilities that couldn't be achieved through conventional approaches. As their ship approached its 4th mission destination, Marcus reflected on how completely his situation had changed. He had started as a victim of circumstances, become a test subject for an alien intelligence, evolved into a partner in planetary salvation, and was now serving as humanity's first ambassador to a galactic community that was being reshaped by human influence. But the most satisfying change was in his relationship with Hunter. The creature that had once stalked him through alien forests now sought out his company for the simple pleasure of discussing impossible problems and even more impossible solutions. Their conversations had become legendary. Among the ship's crew, epic exchanges of ideas that could last for days and often resulted in breakthrough innovations that changed how entire species approached their most fundamental challenges. Hunter had recently confided to Marcus that its people's historical focus on hunting had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of intelligence. They had thought that intelligence was something to be captured, studied, and ultimately consumed. But working with Marcus had taught them that intelligence was actually something to be shared, combined, and amplified through collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Hunter's people had returned to hunting because they thought it was the most intellectually stimulating activity possible. But they had discovered that collaboration was infinitely more challenging, more rewarding, and more transformative than any hunt could ever be. As their ship entered the system containing their next client species, Marcus could see the familiar signs of a civilization facing extinction and preparing for the end. But he also knew that within a few months, that same civilization would be not only surviving their crisis but actively contributing to solutions for other species throughout the galaxy. The universe, it turned out, was full of species that had convinced themselves that their problems were unsolvable, their challenges insurmountable, and their situations hopeless. But as Marcus had learned during his own desperate struggle for survival, the universe looked very different when you approached it with the assumption that every impossible situation was actually an opportunity in disguise. And sometimes, all it took to transform an entire galactic community was one stubborn human who was too foolish to accept that something couldn't be done. Marcus smiled as he watched Hunter preparing for their next planetary salvation project. The creature was using techniques that combined the analytical capabilities of 6 different species with human-inspired chaos engineering principles, approaching problems that would have terrified any conventional engineer with what could only be described as gleeful anticipation. It occurred to Marcus that he had accidentally solved the greatest challenge-facing intelligent species throughout the galaxy, not the technical problems of stellar engineering or planetary salvation, but the psychological problem of believing that some challenges were too big, too complex, or too dangerous to tackle. The secret, as it turned out, was remarkably simple. You just had to be foolish enough to try anyway. And throughout the galaxy, that particular form of foolishness was becoming surprisingly popular.